Okay, so we are moving on this week over to East Africa to the kingdoms of Aksum and Ethiopia. Ethiopia was the one African nation that was never colonized by Europeans, except for about 4 years during World War II by the Italians. It's also one of the oldest continuously Christian nations in the world. Ethiopia has a complicated history, but I think we can organize the medieval period into three main parts. First of all, the Aksumite kingdom, the Zagwe dynasty, and finally the so-called Solomonic line of kings who ruled until 1974. Each period has distinct cultural and material remains. So Axum flourished for over 600 years. It's referred to in the famous Periplus of the Erythraean or Red Sea, written around 50 CE by a Greek-speaking merchant from Egypt, who describes Axum's port at Adulis, trading most importantly ivory, but also tortoise shells, rhino horns, hippo hides, slaves, and apes around the world, with Rome, with Arabia, with India. Mani of the Manichaean heresy, some of you might know what that is, writing around 250, says that Axum is one of the four great empires of his age, the others being Rome, China, and Persia. The people in the empire spoke Greek and Gez, a language that is still used today in liturgical writing, kind of like Latin, I guess, in the West. Gez is related to both Hebrew and Arabic. The Aksumite minted money. And perhaps most importantly, one of its emperors named Ezana adopted Christianity in 330, that is about 15 years after Constantine the Great recognized the legality of Christianity in the Roman Empire. The bronze and gold coins you see here show the change. At the top of the ones on the left, you can see the moon and the crescent, representing the old religion, the worship of the sun and the moon. And on the ones on the right, you can see the cross. Monasteries were also built all over the region. This is Dobre Damo, with probably the oldest church in Ethiopia. You have to, as you can see here, go up ropes. The last part, you have to hike up it, but then go up ropes for the last part. And no women are allowed, not even female cattle, sheep, or chickens. And the little illustration you see there with the snake, that's part of a legend where a snake had brought the saint up to the top for the first time, and that's how he knew to build a monastery there. Axum is probably chiefly known by people for its monumental obelisks or stelae, which date from the 200s to 300s. That is, before, during, and after Ezana adopted Christianity. So far, they found about 720 of these. They look like the design makes the stelae look like palaces with doors on the bottom and windows going all the way up. Archaeologists believe that at the top there might have been an image, perhaps of the king, that was buried in the area. And you can see down below the burial chambers in the vicinity. There are also remains of large mansions from the Aksumite Empire. Here's an example of what was probably an elite residence that is close to the stelae that we just saw in the previous slide. This building had about 50 rooms, what they think is maybe a throne room, kitchens, like a Roman bath, a mini Roman bath, and was probably at least 2 stories. This is called for tourists the Palace of the Queen of Sheba, but it was built in the 500s CE, which is about 1,000 years off. Historians suggest that the spread of Islam into North Africa and Arabia in the 700s ended up disrupting trade between Axum and Arabia. But it's otherwise unclear about why the empire began to weaken in the 600s. That is, historians aren't clear if it's for economic, political, or military problems, or because of these problems. Ethiopia was on good terms with the peoples of Arabia, and Islamic legend actually has Muhammad's family members and inner circle of early followers seeking refuge in Ethiopia for a time. Some suggest it maybe climate change affected grain production, perhaps there was an overgrazing of livestock. Oral tradition and a couple historical notes suggest that a warrior queen called Judith, which I think is normalized to Judith, not normalized, anglicized to Judith, or sometimes she's called Esato, which means fire, invaded from the west around 960 and destroyed by fire a lot of the monasteries and churches. The second major dynasty is called the Zagwe dynasty. And this capital was farther south from where the Aksumite center was. Lalibela is the most well-known of these kings. And in his legend, when he was born, he was surrounded by bees, and his mother interpreted this as a sign that he would rule. Lalibela means the bees recognize his sovereignty. Or also in the Acts of Lalibela, where the story about the bees comes from, we're told that he survived a couple of attempts on the part of his brother to poison him. Lalibela, however, did eventually take power, and once he did, he continued and accelerated a program of building, I would say building, but it's really excavating churches out of rock, as you see here. The site of Roha, which is now called Lalibela, is about 8,000 feet in elevation, high altitude. There are 11 churches at this site, and which was supposed to be modeled on Jerusalem. These churches, or this site, was built during the Crusades and after the Muslims had retaken the Holy Land, and it had become apparently unsafe for pilgrims to go to Jerusalem. And Lalibela wanted to create a new Jerusalem, and it did become, and it remains, a very popular pilgrimage spot. It's said, again, in the Acts of Lalibela, the legend of his life, that men worked by day and angels worked by night. Okay, finally we have the Shawan, or the Solomonic dynasty. This line usurped the Zagwes beginning in 1270. In order to legitimize his seizure of power, Amlak, the first king, appears to have claimed to be a descendant of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. His descendants sponsored the creation of what would become Ethiopia's national epic, the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of Kings, which was written, they believe, around 1320. We're reading just a bit of it, the part where the Queen of Sheba, also known as Makeda, travels from Ethiopia to Israel, having heard of Solomon's great wisdom. He converts her to monotheism, or Judaism, and through a trick, he is able to sleep with her, and when she returns to Ethiopia, she has his son, and she names him Menelik. When he grows up, he returns to Israel to meet his father. Solomon wants him to be his heir, but he refuses. He returns to Ethiopia, however, with the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant presumably houses the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments that God gave to Moses. The point is that the Ethiopians are God's new chosen people. And apparently, if you haven't read yet, also that only males can be rulers. The Ark of the Covenant is housed in the Church of Our Lady, St. Mary of Zion. As you can tell, it was built in the 1950s, but there's been a church in this compound in this area. You can see older ones behind it on the right since Izana, the first Aksumite king, converted in the 300s. This has also been a site. There's been a lot of, I don't know if you guys keep up with politics, but there's been a war being going on with in the Tigray region between the Tigrays and Tigrayans and the Ethiopians, and this was the site of a massacre a couple years ago. I should also mention that in the 1300s, tales of miracles connected with the Virgin Mary became very popular, not just in Ethiopia, but across the globe. We're reading just one of these about how a cannibal's single act of charity is able to gain him salvation through Mary's intercession. These tales are obviously fictional, but like all stories that we're reading in this course, they transmit behavior that is valued. And in this case, it's charity or generosity, right? But also the idea that one can redeem oneself despite one's past atrocious, in this case, deeds. Thanks for listening.